Hello, it's June 15th, and already Campaign 90 is in high gear. Today, thanks to the Vermont Federation of Sportsmen's Clubs, we're going to interview the candidates who wish to be serving the United States Congress next year. We're very fortunate to have all of the candidates with us today. United States congressmen consider a great number of issues, most of them of world importance, but many of them as well of local importance. We're going to skip those cosmic world issues today, even national issues to a great degree. We're going to talk about those things that matter to the sportsmen and sportswomen of Vermont, and certainly beyond Vermont's borders and other states in the United States. Our special guests today are, first, because he's the congressman, Peter Smith, congressman from Vermont.
Hello, Dennis.
Peter is a former state senator, former lieutenant governor, and a resident of Middlesex. Our next is Dolores Sandoval, Dr. Dolores Sandoval, if I was at the University of Vermont, professor at the University of Vermont, and a candidate for the Democratic nomination for the U.S. Congress. Dolores lives in Williston, Vermont. Next we have Bernie Sanders, who is the former mayor of Burlington, Vermont, served 8 years, 4 terms in that capacity, and has also been a visiting professor this past year. Bernie is an independent and is running again for the United States Congress. Next we have Timothy Philbin from Wallingford, Vermont. Tim is a candidate for the Republican nomination, as is Congressman Smith. Tim is an insurance agent. Finally, we have a gentleman that all of you will recognize from many campaigns in Vermont, and that's Peter Diamondstone, who is a candidate with Mrs. Sandoval, Dr. Sandoval, for the Democratic nomination for Congress this year. Peter has been in many campaigns before, and he lives in Brattleboro, Vermont.
And for the Liberty Union nomination as well.
The Liberty Union nomination as well. I'm sorry, Peter, I had forgot that. The format today is that we're going to talk about the environment, conservation, gun control, and we're going to take them pretty much in that order, and we're going to go for about an hour. You'll probably see this program next week, next month, 3 or 4 months from now. It'll be shown on many cable networks, and it will also be shown in many private clubs and living rooms and so forth. We hope you enjoy the program. I said a moment ago that our issue today, or our concerns today, are those which are of most concern and interest to the sportsmen and sportswomen of Vermont. And we're going to start out with Bernie Sanders, who chose number 1. We're going to start out after that with Peter Diamondstone, who's number 2, Dolores Sandoval, number 3, Peter Smith, number 4, and Tim Philbin, number 5. Each will answer our questions in that order. When we've had those questions, each will have a chance, if they choose, to respond to what others have said. We want to make this as freewheeling and as spontaneous as it can possibly be in this rather crowded room at a small table. Since we're talking about sportsmen today, I thought probably the best way to start out is by asking each one of you, and starting with Bernie Sanders. Bernie, how would you define a sportsman?
Dennis, I would define a sportsman not as a sportsman, but a sportsperson to begin with.
All right.
There are many women who are involved in hunting, fishing, and other outdoor activities. Sports people are people who enjoy communion with nature. They enjoy getting out in the woods. They enjoy fishing in a pond. They enjoy taking their kids out away from the hustle and bustle of daily life and making deep contact with nature. In our state, which as you know is one of the most rural states in America, there are tens and tens of thousands of Vermonters to whom going out and hunting and fishing, walking through the snow, walking in the spring, is of extraordinary importance. And very often, these are people who do not have the sums of money to go to the yachting clubs or the country clubs or to buy big boats, but they enjoy what nature has given us. So, as an overview, that's how I would define a sports person.
Okay, very good. Number 2 is Peter Diamondstone. Would you define sportsman for the audience, please, Peter?
No.
All right.
Persons who define themselves as sports persons are sports persons. I'm not going to be presumptuous about this. That's their business, and they call themselves what they want. And people who do certain kinds of activities may or may not call themselves sports persons, but I'm not going to presume to define how people should categorize themselves.
Okay, Dolores.
Well, I think that Bernie gave a good description of the way in which we usually see people who are interested in sports. I would add that I think there's another aspect too, that we tend to think in our minds, we have the perception of a person who's a good sport. And I think that tends to make us think of people who are interested in sports as being a part of that perception. So there's a sportsman-like or sportswoman-like kind of behavior that we also attach in our minds. And I think this is a part of the picture also.
All right. Thank you. Peter, Congressman Smith.
Sportsman, sportsperson means to me people in Vermont who are the ultimate environmentalists, the ultimate conservationists, men and women and children who use the out of doors and almost to a person, whether it is with a fishing rod and lying lightly in their hands or a gun and they're out for fowl or for game. Their pride is that they leave the site the way they found it, if not better. They care deeply about habitat issues, about wetlands issues. When I got involved with the lamprey sighting issue in Lake Champlain, who did I hear about that first from? I heard about it from sportsmen and women in Vermont who said, we're losing our lake, and we're losing the fish, and we're losing the attractiveness. Same with the oil spill legislation for Lake Champlain that we got through on the oil spill bill. Who did I hear from first? I heard from sportsmen who said, we have barges taking over 1 million gallons of oil up and down Lake Champlain every year. May not sound like a lot to the national guys, but if one of those barges breaks up in Lake Champlain, it's going to be devastating for the lake, and we were able to do something about it. So to me, sportsmen and women and young people involved are environmentalists, conservationists, people who love nature, love to be in it, love to use it, love to leave it better and see it better than when they found it.
Tim?
Dennis, sportsmen are just people like you and I. And they're Vermonters who care, as everybody has said, about the environment, who care about the challenge of themselves against nature. They cross political and ideological lines. They're Democrats, they're Republicans, they're liberals, they're conservatives, they're independents. And their biggest concern is to maintain the freedoms that they have so long and so hard fought for. The ability to hunt, the ability to fish, the ability to hike wherever and whenever they want to, within reason, to provide the protections of individual property owners. These people are involved in helping us make decisions as far as our deer herd is concerned, issues as far as the moose season is concerned, salmon fishing, and the return of Lake Champlain to its pristine beauty. Those people, again, are the backbone of this state. Those are the people who, like you and I, are the ones that this state is designed to be protected by, because they, more than anyone else, deal directly with the nature and the beauty of Vermont. One cannot specifically indicate any purpose that they have other than to enjoy the environment.
Okay. Let me follow up just a little bit on that question before any of you care to respond. Are there any activities that you think are not sportsman activities? For example, I don't know if anyone has mentioned trapping today. I don't know if anyone has mentioned snowmobiling. Are there anything which you think does not belong in Vermont's woods? We do use national land in Vermont for a number of sporting activities.
I think...
wait a second, we better go in the order. Bernie?
I think there is a potential danger which our citizens are handling well in terms of such areas as snowmobiling. What we have to make certain is that our natural areas are utilized as best as they can. So I think what we want to do is be clear in separating areas where people can use snowmobiles from areas where people can simply walk and enjoy nature. So I think what we want to make sure is that what we have is utilized as best it can by all people, and that one group does not infringe upon the other.
And you don't know of any problems right now?
Well, I suspect that there are problems.
All
I
right.
can't tick them off, but I think we've got to be conscious of those problems and make sure that one group does not infringe on the rights of others.
Dolores?
Oh,
Sorry, Peter.
Peter, yes.
Peter Diamondstone.
two things. Maybe we ought to rotate the first and start each time with a
Why don't we
different
answer the
person.
question?
I will. But I'll make my observation anyway. And if you don't like my answer, I still got my 2 minutes to do it in.
Yeah, go ahead.
The second is that I think we ought to think about the private concessionaires that are allowed to go into park areas and sell their popcorn and their wares that are commercial invasions of our parklands and our forest lands. Secondly, I think we ought to be very careful about the invasions of wetlands by marinas, for instance, and protecting our shoreline in that way, and protecting our shoreline coastally against offshore drilling, against operations like Exxon's. I mean, that's such a minor one. Many, many, many more gallons of oil was spilled before the Exxon tanker dumped in Alaska. Those are the kinds of invasions of our natural resources that, as congresspersons, I think we should be looking at. I'm not, let the people of the legislature of the state of Vermont deal with snowmobilers who are disturbing the peace and things of that sort.
Dolores.
Well, I think nationally, we have an interest in making sure that there is plenty of space, not only for today's interested individuals, but for tomorrow's. And I know back in the 60s, visiting Yosemite Park, it was already difficult then to even find space, and there were the campfires and this kind of program and problem concerning programming. So we want to be aware now of what the problems will be in the future and really plan so that there will not be this conglomeration of individuals on a few sites. So I think that's one of the greatest problems for us, and so that...
But do you know of anything specifically that needs to be done in Vermont, Dolores? Is there an abuse that you think of the use of federal lands? Anything that you can think of?
I don't, because I'm not that kind of an individual. It's an area that I'll have to look into, obviously. But I do know one thing about Vermont, that there are avenues for people who do have concerns to work with the problem and to get others involved. And nationally, that kind of behavior is changing very strongly as people speak out when there is an issue that concerns them.
Peter?
I want to use snowmobilers as an example and then get to an area which I think could be a potential problem here in Vermont. In the beginning, when snowmobiles first were developed and sold in Vermont, there was a lot of disagreement about them, and frankly, snowmobilers felt with some justification that there were other people in this state that were looking down their nose at them, that this was a loud, disruptive activity. But in fact, what it also was an wonderful sporting and family activity for Vermonters in the winter who before had not had some other things to do. And it brought families together, clubs were formed, and look what's happened in the last 15 years, because it's an extraordinary story of group responsibility. The clubs run the system, the snowmobile trail system runs all over the state of Vermont. It is groomed, it is beautiful. The industry that produces machines have not only produced better machines, but quieter and more environmentally safe and less polluting machines. And in fact, what you have is one of the finest stories I know in Vermont, I suspect across this country, of a group of people who were engaged in an activity, seeing value in that activity, understanding the challenge they were up against, and in fact creating a situation where now many cross-country skiers use snowmobile trails, and there's a very happy kind of cohabitation in the woods in the winter that frankly wasn't there 20 years ago. I'm not capable at this point to be absolutely specific about it, but I know in the West that there is going to be similar kind of concern about all-terrain vehicles. Because they do not have the cover of snow to protect the soil. They do have business uses, ranchers and farmers use them, that's one thing. But there is concern in our national parks about where and when and how all-terrain vehicles can be used on steep slopes, rocky soil, thin soil cover. And I think rather than getting all urgent about it, we simply need to understand that we have another kind of a problem. People are going to have to sit down and think about it, and I'm sure we can work it out. But that's one that I think is going to take some people working together, which is what solving any problem takes, to get an answer to, at least in the western part of this country.
Thank you. Tim Philbin.
The one issue that I see that concerns sportsmen, whatever that sport might be, is their lack of control and input on the legislative and regulatory process that affects the very activities that they are overseeing. Mr. Smith is correct in that many of the sports organizations throughout the state have worked very, very hard to regulate, to protect, and police their own hobbies and activities, and they've done a wonderful job. But above and beyond that, there are bureaucrats and professional politicians who would limit some of the activities and some of the freedoms that they have. So my biggest concern for sports people is that they need to be able to become more involved in that process to protect those freedoms for themselves and future generations. I don't want to see them lose that.
Okay. Now, before we see if there's any response to any of you, I just want to make sure that we're real clear on this. If I ticked off the following: hunting, fishing, trapping, sport shooting, shooting ranges, snowmobiles, that basically none of you have any problems with those happening on federal lands. We have 39% of Vermont
Whoa.
is... Okay,
What?
fine, you do.
You want to run that by me once again?
Hunting, fishing, trapping, sport shooting, and snowmobiling. You may think of something
Okay.
else, but none of you have any
All right.
problems with federal lands being used for any of those activities at all. Okay, fine. Let's move over to Lake Champlain. Congressman Smith mentioned this in his introduction. Oh, excuse me, I didn't give you an opportunity to respond to any of the first questions. Anyone want to respond anywhere along the way?
Just to say this, that when we talk about what types of activities will infringe upon people who enjoy the outdoors, I think probably we have ignored the most significant, and that is the very rapid development which is taking place in many areas of our state, which I think, if not sensibly controlled, is going to make it very much harder in years to come for people to enjoy hunting. I think we have got to touch upon the issue of the pollution of the lake, of course, which we're going to get to in a moment, because if we don't stop the forces that are destroying our lakes and streams, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to be free to fish and not being able to eat the fish that you are catching. And that is becoming an increasingly serious problem in our state and throughout the country. So we cannot ignore the basic issue of infringing development, wiping out areas that people have historically enjoyed.
Okay.
And I would like to add
Dolores,
that
yeah?
I'm very pleased along these lines, although it's not federal lands, the waterfront in Burlington that will now be available to all the people. And that's a very important statement. Having lived in the Midwest and seeing the importance of Lake Michigan to Chicago and the people in that vicinity and the easy access, I was especially pleased to see this occur in Burlington also.
Peter, we missed you. I'm sorry. Did you have a comment here on anything that's been said? Okay. Tim Philbin? Peter Smith, I'm sorry. No, Tim Philbin?
My concern is something that may be alluded to by Congressman Smith, and that it might be the potential of some federal legislation, possibly from what you might be saying, against people that are using all-terrain vehicles. I hope that's not the case. You pointed out that people had a concern about snowmobiles in the beginning, and the organizations formed, came together, police their own things, set their own rules, and it's very nice to see it. I enjoy hearing them fly by the house on a heavy snowfall at night. I don't want to see legislation come in without organized groups first working on solving the problem themselves.
That's exactly, if I just may, that's why I use the snowmobilers as the example. We have a model for this. Maybe a Vermont model, but again and again, what I would say is that Vermont's values do have an instructional value for the rest of this country, and I think that's exactly why I put it the way I put it.
Okay. Let's move on to Lake Champlain. Our time is moving, as you can see. I've got a real gripe about this particular question. My gripe is this. 20 years ago, I can remember Vermonters, especially in this area, saying, oh my gosh, Lake Champlain is going downhill fast, it's being polluted at a rapid rate, high PC in Ticonderoga, and there's also, I think there was mercury in the fish and so forth. And 20 years later, we're starting to do the same thing. The same song and dance is being done. What are we going to do? What would you do if you're in the Congress next January to make sure that 20 years from now, We don't do the same song and dance we're doing today and did 20 years ago. What are you going to do to make sure that Lake Champlain is a better and a much better lake 20 years from now? And we'll start off with Bernie Sanders, who's number
Thank
one.
you, Dennis.
Remember, you got 2 minutes, Bernie.
You
You're
have-
not going to rotate? I'm sorry, I just thought you were
Let
going to.
me just respond.
Go ahead, Bernie.
To this question. Obviously, as mayor of the city of Burlington for 8 years, the issue of the lake was one of the major issues that we were obliged to deal with. You talk about 20 years ago, I can go back, I can't go back, some can go back 50 years ago, and understand that because of the antiquated sewer system in Burlington, tremendous amounts of raw sewage were going into that lake.
Right.
And while it is true that we, a few years ago in Burlington, called attention to that and said, look, we have a real problem, and you can't go swimming in the lake after a heavy downpour, because we got a lot of crap in that lake that is unhealthy for people. We called attention to that, but that problem, in fact, has been going on for decades and decades. I am very proud of the role that the city of Burlington played, working with state government in developing what is, in fact, probably, perhaps, the most significant environmental protection program in the history of the state, certainly the most expensive. We're talking about a $52 million program, half of which came from the people of the city of Burlington. Our rates, water rates are going way up, but we bit the bullet because we knew that making sure that Lake Champlain remains clean is the most important environmental issue that we could deal with. Second part of that question, how are we going to preserve the lake is what you asked. Well, it's not only Lake Champlain, it's lakes and rivers all over the United States of America, and that takes us to a very, very basic issue that has to do with the priorities of the United States Congress. Now, I have very, very little patience for people in Congress who say, gee, I know that there's an environmental problem. I know that lakes and streams all over America are in trouble. We just don't have the money to provide the help to the cities and towns for the cleanup that's necessary. Dennis, where that question takes us is to this. This nation has to decide whether we continue to spend $300 billion on the military, or whether, in fact, we cut that military budget in half within 5 years, so that we can put money into environmental protection and cleaning up our lakes and streams. It has to do whether we continue to give huge tax breaks to the very richest people in this country, people whose real income has doubled in the last 12 or 13 years, or whether we say, folks, that party is over, we need that money for environmental protection, housing, and all of the other areas that our communities are suffering from today. Those are some of the concerns that I have on that issue.
Peter Diamondstone.
I tend to agree with Bernie fundamentally. I'll dispute how much we would save out of the $300 billion to apply to those needs. My own view is that most of those would go to relocation of persons and to retraining and so on. But I think the issue is, how are we going to let development go on along our lakes, internal lakes and rivers? Not that, and on the outside I mentioned offshore drilling and use of the ocean. How are we going to deal with the fishing rights that allow seals to be taken and dolphins to be taken in with tuna? I mean, it's a much broader question than all of that. And one, we have to deal with some international problems, and one, we have to deal with some domestic problems of development. And where are we going to focus? Are we going to focus on industrial development that produces profit, or are we going to focus on protecting the natural resources of the planet for the use of future generations? And Bernie raises it as a money question. I don't think it's a money question. I think it's a question of how we as politicians view it and how the community views it. And as long as people are frightened about not having jobs and so on, and not seeing that we can have just as good jobs protecting the environment as we can have building crap that nobody needs, then we have the problem. We have to take a leadership role in showing folks that there are lots of good jobs to be had and lots of good things to be done, and they're useful and productive jobs that produce better, just as good incomes, and they provide better life for not only the people who are doing them, but for the whole of the society.
Thank you. Dolores, if you're Congresswoman in January, what initiatives will you take to make Lake Champlain a better lake?
Well, I would support the initiatives that have already been undertaken with the Special Designation Act of 1990, which was sponsored in the Senate by our Senators Leahy and Jeffords and New York Senators D'Amato and Moynihan, and it's in conjunction with Quebec also. And it's in the House, Peter Smith, and I don't recall the other congressman.
Thank you. David O.B. Martin from
David
New
O.B.
York.
Martin,
Thank
okay.
you.
So our Vermont delegation has been very active in support of this special act. And part of that special act, the instigation of it perhaps came about from UNESCO. And we don't participate very well with UNESCO as a nation anymore, but they designated Lake Champlain as a part of their Man in the Biosphere program because of the excellence in the ways in which New York and Vermont and Quebec have been handling Lake Champlain. Now, there's no question there are problems there, and they have to be worked on, but they're saying that we have an exceptionally good record with Lake Champlain, and they want to see it as one of the resources of the world kept in that way. So this special act will set up a research project concerning it. There will be a lake management conference, and there will be efforts on the part of the universities in the state and in New York working on this research. There will be citizens involved in that process. So it seems to be a very good format and process that's been set up. And had I been in Congress already, I would have been a part of that. And in January, I would be a part of it. Continuation, definitely.
All right, and you're convinced that that's the path to cleaning up Lake Champlain?
That's a part of it.
Okay.
It's a concerted look at the effort, and it's bringing all sides of the waters together.
Congressman Peter Smith?
Well, I want to thank Dolores for the lead-in to my statement, quite frankly. Look, when we talk about Lake Champlain, we're talking about a specific example of a large and very diverse problem having to do with water and other media all over this world. I'm very proud of the fact that the League of Conservation Voters, which is the largest and most reputable umbrella group of environmental organizations in Washington, gave me a 100% ranking and has endorsed my candidacy for re-election. Now, why did they do that? They did it for a variety of reasons, all of which have to do directly with Lake Champlain. One, I ran on, supported, and we're about, I think, to pass a bill that'll make the head of EPA a cabinet-level position so that natural resource questions will be at the cabinet table with all the other issues. We're the only major democracy that doesn't do that already. Two, we've worked on a clean air bill, and we've got a tough clean air bill with a very strong acid rain provision and good toxic and automotive provisions in it in conference committee right now. So when you get to Lake Champlain specifically, here's where the rubber hits the road, Dennis. It's easy to talk big in a political campaign. I've been down there for a year and a half, and I've had to do the job. We had the oil spill bill. I fought with and it turned out to be the majority, to successfully beat back the oil companies that wanted to allow the federal government to preempt state standards if those standards were higher in protecting bodies of water. And we said no to that. The reasons we said no to that is because the states are leading in this issue, and we had to say no to it. We then amended that bill to put the oil spill provision for Lake Champlain into it. We've also worked, as Dolores said, with the Lake Champlain Initiative. It is a $25 million program that can create a special designation for Lake Champlain, running up the tributaries, up the watersheds, 2 states, the province of Quebec, and trying to get an overall education and management plan for that lake. And that is the way to preserve it as a jewel, preserve it as a place for sportsmen and sportswomen, preserve it as the 6th largest body of fresh water in this country, as a unique body of water for all the public to use.
Thank you. One thing that's not clear from the answers so far, and maybe we can get back to this in a moment, is what will be done to clean up what is there, not just preserve what's there, but to clean up what is there as well. Tim?
I'd like to see us work very hard to make sure that the pollution that is now going into that lake ends. There is no need for everyone here in Vermont to pay for the pollution that is being caused by a select few. I want that stopped. And it's wonderful that there's a 100% environmental rating, but the issue here is Lake Champlain. The issue here is sports fishermen who are having a real problem going fishing and having lamprey eel stuck all over the very item that they'd like to fish for. I need us to see to it that the lamprey eel problem is stopped. In order to do that, you also have to, at the same time, solve the problem of pollution from places like Burlington. That needs to stop. You need to be able to say no more. You need to go to the industries along that lake and that waterfront, and you need to also talk to people in New York and say the same thing. No more.
Thank you very much. Now, to Bernie, you want to respond?
Yeah, just,
Please go ahead.
Tim, I hope you're not suggesting that in terms of Burlington's effort, where we have spent $26 million for a city of 40,000, that the people of Burlington have not responded to that crisis and have spent as much money in terms of this type of problem as any community its size in the United States of America. And in terms of statement that it's easy to talk big in a campaign and so forth and so on, The fact of the matter is that this is exactly what the issue that Congress is going to have to deal with. Do you continue to spend $300 billion on the military when the Cold War is over and cut military spending by 2% or 4%? Or do you finally decide that in terms of the priorities of this nation, clean water, clean air, and all of the other needs that have been ignored for so many years by a Republican administration and a Democratic Congress get to be addressed?
Okay.
There is a crisis. The
Thank you.
crisis has
Thank
got to
you.
be
Yeah.
addressed.
Fine, we'll get right down to you. Sure. Peter Diamondstone, any comment there?
I was thinking about the qualities of pollution. For instance,
20 seconds, Peter. Go ahead.
I was thinking about the qualities of pollution. For instance, in sewage treatment plants, we're using bromine to clear up our sewage so that it can be then disposed of in a clean way, but bromine is poisoning the fish, and so we have cancer-ridden fish. We're using chlorine to clean up the water, and chlorine is a natural poison that destroys us and our kidneys. So there are quick fix ideas that are used very often for these, and they promote industrial jobs.
Okay. Yeah.
I think we have to approach it from a different point of view.
Thank you. Good point. Dolores?
Yes, this same initiative really is to look at part of it is the water pollution control, because Lake Champlain Basin serves at least 10 counties. So lamprey control and the salmonid restoration is part of it, as well as wildlife habitat assessment are all written into this bill. So it is the first steps to try and control, and it has been done by a bipartisan effort in Congress.
Peter?
And I want to thank Dolores again for pointing out how great the Lake Champlain initiative is that we are already working on. And that's my point. Bernie, it may give you heartburn to hear this, but we're already moving. Now, wait a minute. It's my turn, Chief.
Didn't say
Okay,
a word.
you were about to.
Done.
15 seconds, Peter.
The fact of the matter is, I voted against the defense budget last year because it was too high. I am leading a group on the peace dividend. There will be reductions in the defense budget. We're moving on it. We can make, whether it's 50% or 33 or 40%, we can make those cuts. They will go in part to the environment. But the bottom line is, I've been down there doing the job. We've done good things for Lake Champlain. We've done good things for the environment with both the EPA and the Clean Air Bill, and I'm proud of that record, and that's why I've been endorsed by the League of
Tim?
Conservation Voters.
It's not that we have less pollution, Mr. Sanders, it's that we should have no pollution. And thank you for the big picture. But from Vermonters' standpoint, it's that waterfront. And that's what people are looking at right now. You need to bring the perspective back home. I have said it before, you need to look at it from the viewpoint of Vermonters. And the issues of talking about defense budgets and peace dividends. We're talking about fishermen out there, people that enjoy trapping, people that enjoy hunting. And I understand that those are important issues.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, one thing we didn't clear up at this, on Lake Champlain, do you all support, sounds as if you do, maybe Peter Diamondstone does not, but let me ask you clearly. Do you all support the Lampricide program, which is about to begin, which will take 4 to 5 years, and is in a sense a pollutant? If you know your Latin, lampricide means kill the lampreys. Do you all support this particular program, which is just now beginning after many years of travail and argument and whatever with New York State? And Bernie?
I don't claim expertise on it.
Okay.
Familiarity with it. Obviously, there are some people who are concerned that when you put chemicals in the water that we drink, it's a problem. They have a right to be very, very concerned about it. There are other people who point out that similar type programs exist throughout the country, which have worked effectively in dealing with the lampricide problem and have not resulted in any health problems at all. When you do anything that impacts upon the water in terms of chemicals, it is an issue of great concern. My understanding, and talking to some of the people here in the state who administer the program, is that what we are promoting is in fact safe, will work, and I would support it.
Peter Diamondstone?
No, I would
No?
not
Okay.
support using poisons in our water to destroy the lamprey eels. What I would suggest is that what lamprey eels feed on can be removed or cleaned up or prevented from being in the lake and let them go their natural way. I don't think that we should be adding chemicals to it to take life. I mean, that
Okay.
just seems like removing one pollutant and adding another. And I don't have a hell of a lot of confidence in folks who tell me that when you put poison into water that kills one kind of an animal, that it's not going to affect others.
Dolores?
Well, the EPA did disagree with the Fish and Wildlife Agency on that, because Lake Champlain does provide water to over 50 communities plus other individual situations. And so they have recommended reviewing it with caution for that very reason, because they say that to date there's been no determination as to the concentrations of TFM or the Bayer 73 that would be acceptable in drinking water, and there's a lack of data to help establish human tolerance of this in the water. So I would back away from this at this point. I think new research is needed, and quickly, so that we can know, because obviously the lampreys are an ongoing problem, and this situation will impact on the hatchery. So we need to do something very quickly, but in the meantime, my water that I drink is from Lake Champlain, and there are so many people whose existence is contingent on this.
So you're saying maybe, but a little more study.
Yes, before we start, let's have the study. Because it's been used medicinally, but that's with individuals and not continuously as a daily intake.
Congressman Smith. Peter.
I would say we can proceed. Both sides have been heard. The program has been implemented in the Great Lakes and in the Finger Lakes in New York. The problem has been studied. And the fact of the matter is there is some warfare inside the bureaucracy between the regional EPA and the Fish and Wildlife people. It's been going on for a long time, and this is exactly, I would argue, one of those so-called local issues. I've been out on a boat. I've went out with Rich Greeno, saw the situation, and as one who grew up on Lake Champlain, I think I was like many people. I keep looking at that lake, thinking I'm seeing it the way it was in 1953. And it's changing, and we need this program. We need it, and we need it badly. And by the way,
You see no need for further study at this point?
the study has been done, and I think I support the lamprey-siding program.
Tim?
I do.
Gilpin?
I support the
Okay.
lamprey program to protect our lake.
Okay, fine.
Comment?
Yes, quickly.
Why was this information and this research not available to the regional office of the EPA, that they would make this decision and not have this information available to them?
It was available, and I don't know their reasoning, but I think their conclusion was that it was that they wanted to do it again, and I understand that caution. But if you talk to sportsmen and sportswomen, and there's a division of opinion on this, Bernie was very accurate in what he said. At some point, though, and if you're in the Congress, I'm here to hope you won't be. You'll understand that at some point you simply got to plant your feet and take a vote and let the chips fall where they may. And I've tried to do that on a number of issues. And my choice is that on lamprey siding, now's the time. The data's in, and it will be safe. It will be good for the lake. It'll be good for the fish, good for marine life, bad for lampreys, and that's just the way we want it.
Fine.
Dennis,
Yes,
is it appropriate to ask Peter a short question?
You go right ahead. On this subject?
Relevant to what he said.
Okay, go right ahead. Yeah.
Peter, you mentioned quite correctly that you have been endorsed by the League of Conservation Voters. Can you tell the people how many candidates were in the race when you received that endorsement?
There were no candidates in the race, but in fact, the quote was, when you have 100% voting record and have done what you, Peter Smith, have done for the environment, it doesn't matter who the opponent is. Quote, unquote, and I'm sure that included people at this table. The point is, they were rewarding a record. They were rewarding a record that was able to stand apart from the president on the Clean Air Bill. And that's what they did, and they did it.
The point is, they endorsed you when there was no other candidate in the race at all. And that is the way, and I happen to respect the League of Conservation Voters, but I have a problem with the way business is done in Washington. When you endorse a candidate, before you know of who his or her opponents are, I have a problem with that process.
Okay.
Well,
Anything else
I
want to
have
make?
a-
Hold on
Yeah.
just a second.
Well, you-
Just a second. Wait a minute,
you've been
Peter.
there.
Peter, go ahead. Then Dolores and Tim.
I would address a question to Bernie
Quickly.
in that regard. May I speak with that?
Yes.
This is the
Okay.
second time you've
I
interrupted me
apologize.
before I got
Apologize. All
even
right.
started.
Okay, please
right.
go ahead.
The only question I would address to you, Bernie, is do you know how many candidates the NEA considered before it gave you its endorsement? Are you now ready to reject that NEA endorsement here at this table?
I don't know how many candidates.
Well,
there
I'll tell you it was
but I
three.
think that Peter, well, that may well be the case. I do know that Peter Smith went through the entire process and apparently had no problems with the process when he went through it. I'm pretty sure that Dolores was interviewed. I don't know who else was interviewed, Peter.
Can I?
Tim, Dolores, sorry.
I'm next.
Yes.
Okay. Well,
Wait
under
a minute, wait a minute.
conservation, it was during Mayor Clavel's role in office, that the waterfront has been really used for the public, because under your administration, it was to be a Trump-style
What style?
Donald Trump
Oh.
style, with condominiums and marinas, high-rise hotel and boutiques. And it was the people of Burlington who said they wanted more than a 30-foot walking path. And this is the result now, that with the legislation from the state, as well as working with the railroads,
Okay.
this has been brought
Good.
about.
Tim, any comment?
That's conservation.
By the way, Mr. Sanders, I'm still hoping the NEA will speak to me and offer me an endorsement during this primary.
I hope the NEA will do the same for me, Phil.
Thank you very much, and maybe we can meet with them together.
Yeah.
I find it interesting here that, who's a better environmentalist? The bottom line here is protecting the rights of sportsmen. It's not whether or not you get a 100% rating, or there's 2 people in this vote, or there's 6 people. The bottom line is protecting the rights of sports people in this state. And let's not lose focus on that, folks.
Peter, I think we're going to have to, you did have your chance on that one, I think. yes.
2 seconds.
No, I
because-
think you had your chance, Peter. I think we really need to move along.
I'll
Thank
save
you.
it. I'll
Okay,
save it,
very good.
okay.
Let's go on now to the firearms issue. Our time is running kind of short here. It's the last issue on the list here. And I think I'm going to start off this part of the discussion with a question you have all had before. I've had it as a candidate, and you'll probably have it again this year. So let's just start off again with Bernie and go on to Peter and Dolores and Peter Smith and Tim Philbin. From a questionnaire that we've all seen before, once again, do you support additional restrictions on firearms? Do you support additional restrictive firearms legislation? Excuse me, if you are in Congress in January, will you support additional restrictive firearm legislation? Bernie Sanders, and explain yourself.
Dennis?
Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay.
2 years ago, I went before the Vermont Sportsmen's Federation and the SAVE groups, and they asked exactly that same question. It is a controversial question. I know how they felt on the issue. What I did, and that was before the DeConcini bill, that was before a lot of discussion about the Brady bill, that was before New Jersey and California passed bills limiting assault weapons. I went before the Sportsmen of Vermont and I said, I have concerns about certain types of assault weapons that have nothing to do with hunting. I believe in hunting. I will not support any legislation which limits the rights of Vermont or any other hunters to practice what they enjoy and have enjoyed for decades. I do have concerns about certain types of assault weapons. I said that before the election. The Vermont sports people, as is their right, made their endorsements. They endorsed Peter Smith. They endorsed Paul Poirier. I lost that election by about 3.5 percentage points, a very close election. Was my failure to get that endorsement pivotal? It might have been. We don't know. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. All that I can say is I told the sports people of Vermont what I believed before the election, and I'm going to say it again. I do believe that we need to ban certain types of assault weapons. I have talked to police chiefs. I have talked to the police officers out on the street. I've read some of the literature all over this country. Police officers, police chiefs are concerned about certain types of weapons which are ending up in the hands of drug dealers and other criminals, and our police officers are getting outgunned. So the answer is I would support something similar to a DeConcini-type bill which bans about 9 very specific types of weapons and allows that decision to be made within the United States Congress and not the bureaucracy. That's the best answer that I can give to that question.
Thank you.
at this
Peter
time.
Diamondstone.
Yeah, I want to make 2 observations. First, I have to divide restriction on weapons into 2 categories. Those that regulate where they can be discharged and in what context, and those that regulate in keeping and bearing them. As to discharge of them, I have no problem with making it a serious crime for discharging them under certain circumstances. In the town of Brattleboro, there are already discharge laws about where you can discharge firearms and where not. I have no objection to that kind of restriction. I do have objection to firearms restrictions that relate to keeping and bearing arms. And they go to, and any politician or anyone else who talks about this problem without dealing with both the first and the second, or so-called flag burning along with keeping and bearing arms, is missing the whole point of the discussion. The leaders of our society have tried to pit those who believe in flag burning as a legitimate kind of way of expressing themselves against those who believe in keeping bearing arms regardless of what they are. And vice versa. I, as an American Legionnaire, find my organization opposing the right to burn the flag and in favor of the right of people to keep and bear arms. I think that that's divisive. We should all be joining together to protect both of those constitutional protections. They are derived directly from our Declaration of Independence, and it always comes home to haunt when we give our rights away by splitting ourselves apart and not supporting both or all of the constitutional rights.
Right on in the second. Thank you, Peter. Dolores, do you support additional restrictive firearm legislation if you're Congresswoman next year?
Yes, and I'll say why. Because I grew up in a family with 4 males, 2 that felt very strongly about hunting and target shooting, and 2 who didn't feel that way at all. And I know the complications of the problems and the divisiveness of it. But certainly, all the polls show that the American public, over 70%, are very concerned about this. And the DeConcini bill is really to say a moratorium for 3 years while this is studied. Because we don't need Uzis, we don't need Kalashnikovs, we don't need guns called Striker and Street Sweeper and AK-47s that are a part of that bill. And I think that we need to change our attitude because American people feel that it's freedom and a difference with license. And the NRA and the sports groups and the police officers should get together in that 3-year period and come up with a consensus. There's no right and wrong to it. It's just 2 very opposing ideas, and there needs to be some way to bring about a different solution so that people who are interested in sport artillery that are guns that are different from the weapons, the assault weapons. But again, my position on decriminalization of drugs, if we would look further at that, this is the reason why that bill is put forward, to attack the drug dealers and so forth who are outgunning the police. We're not starting at the right end of the problem, is what I want to say.
Thank you. Peter Smith, will you, if you're reelected, support additional restrictive firearm legislation?
Since I have been elected, let me say that if they bring the DeConcini bill or H.R. 1190, as we have agreed it would be amended, which is not quite the exact form that it was written in a year and a half ago, and will restrict the Secretary of the Treasury in terms of adding guns to the floor, I will vote for them. I will not vote for the McHugh bill, which they may bring to the floor, H.R. 4225, precisely because it goes too far and gives the Secretary of Treasury carte blanche. The fact of the matter is this is a tough issue. I've taken some heat on it. But the fact of the matter is that when you look at the situation in this country, the issue comes down to whether or not you think 16-year-olds, young men or young women, ought to be able to buy an Uzi or an AK-47 over the counter. My choice is no. In 1988, the debate and the discussion, and I reference you to an article in the Burlington Free Press, was about national waiting period, and I came down opposed to that. I am still opposed to that. I'm in favor of same-day verification. I think that's a prudent way to go, and I think we can, in fact, treat gun owners with the respect they deserve and make the separation with the same-day verification program.
Thank you. Tim Philbin, if you're elected, would you support additional restrictive firearm legislation?
I would not, and there's a real important, there are 3 reasons for that, and Mr. Diamondstone has clearly pointed that out. It is a constitutional question. The reason we have a free government, Mr. Smith, is because people know that if that government becomes a tyranny, they have, as a citizen's militia, the right to once again change that. They do not control the Army, they do not control the National Guard. That's the purpose of it. That's the purpose of having that in our Constitution. It is not a hunter's issue. When you talk, or if you were to talk to hunters, you would find out the other issues involved in this is representation and credibility. Representation is, if there's an issue facing the nation, you should, as you said before, take Vermont's values to Washington. And Vermont's values are different. Yes, we're all touched by what happened in Stockton, California. You're a parent, I'm a parent. I'm assuming everybody here is, and the horror, but we need to take Vermont's viewpoint to that discussion. And the last one, and the most important one, is credibility. When you run for office, and you say something, and you stand by it, and you ask people to donate money, and you ask people to work on your campaign, and you ask people, more importantly, for their vote, and do the opposite, that concerns them. That's not representation. There's a real concern about credibility. You indicated to people that you would not, and you changed that. And maybe there was information that came in that said, something needs to be changed. But you need to go back to the people and say, new information. We need to discuss this. I need your input. As we talked about the snowmobilers, they too need to have that kind of input. So people like you and I will know what hunters feel about that, gun owners feel about that, Vermonters feel about that. That's the bottom line on this issue.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim, and
I-
we'll give you all just a very quick 10 to 20 seconds response to that because we have to get along and do our closing here. Sorry about that, but we're just going to have to go in order right here. And Bernie, do you have anything to add to this very quickly?
To a significant degree, I agree with what Mr. Filburn said. The reason I think that this issue is as high as it is on the political agenda this campaign is not primarily about guns. I think it has something to do with credibility.
Okay.
As I indicated 2 years ago, I told the people how I felt on this issue. I'm doing it now, may lose votes as a result of that, but that's how I stand.
Peter Diamondstone.
There is one restriction that I would put on that I want to make clear. I don't think that citizens should be able to have any more weapons than the state militia has, the National Guard. I think I would accept that kind of a limitation. At the moment, that's not much of a limitation, but I think we should reduce the weapons in the hands of the National Guard as well.
Thank you, Peter. And Dolores.
I think we have to recognize the level of fear that the average individual has concerning this, and it's that same kind of fear that has outlawed smoking on airplanes, because it's freedom versus license. When my freedom goes over onto your freedom, it becomes license. And when there is this fear of people having this kind of gun and the ammunition and so forth, and the impact on the community as well as the police, then this fear has to be addressed, and that's what the DeConcini bill does. It gives us 3 years to look further at the situation.
Peter Smith.
I would just look Tim Philbin and Bernie Sanders in the eye and say, what you are saying is absolute political garbage. Now, Tim, I know you come from a long tradition and you believe it. Bernie, I have to say I respect you, but I am surprised to see you buying the national NRA strategy. They said the same thing about George Bush and Ronald Reagan and Barry Goldwater when they changed their position on semi-automatic assault weapons. And the fact of the matter is, they said the same thing when plastic gun legislation passed the Congress, the same thing when Cop Keller bullets passed the Congress.
Peter, please.
You got the endorsement of the NRA.
These weapons are
Gentlemen,
classified
gentlemen.
themselves, and I'm disappointed.
Okay.
Don't talk about, you want to
Tim
talk about guns?
Philbin.
Let's talk about guns. That's
Tim.
the issue.
No, I don't think.
Tim, please.
Bottom line here, Mr. Smith, is do you support additional restrictive firearm legislation? No. And you answered the questions, you gave a promise, you told them, you signed it, and you went back on it. That's the issue for these people. That's why they have a problem with professional politicians who will say one thing to get elected and do something else when elected, sir. That's the difference. That's
right.
what you have to respond to.
I said that when we began this hour, I wanted this to be as spontaneous and freewheeling as possible, and I think the question and answer period has come pretty close to that. We're a little bit over our time now, but that's all right because we'll be able to do some editing and keep this within an hour's time. We're going to finish up now. We're going to give each one of you 2 minutes to sum up your positions in regard to sportsmen and sportswomen's issues in the state of Vermont. And I'm going to just introduce your 2-minute period with a question. What can you do for Vermont's sportsmen and sportswomen, a very large group of your future constituents? Should you do anything? And we'll begin as we did with Bernie Sanders as number 1. You got 2 minutes, Bernie.
Mr. Filburn may disagree with me, but I think the issues facing Vermont's sportsmen and women, the issues facing Vermont's environmentalists, are tied up with some very basic issues facing the entire country. There is something wrong when the best environmentalists in this country tell us that if we continue along the same road in terms of energy consumption and energy development, if we continue along the same road in terms of development, in terms of pollution, in terms of our dependency on the automobile, we may not have an environment to leave to our children and grandchildren. Clearly, there must be radical changes in our national priorities. We cannot continue to do the same thing that we have done. Now, Mr. Smith has told us that he has a 100% rating, and I support that. I think you've done a good job on the issues that have come before the United States Congress. My concern is that the most important issues in terms of the environment facing the people are not dealt with the United States Congress, because to a very large degree, the Congress is dominated by very large corporations, by chemical companies, by automobile companies, who are much more concerned about making immediate profits than in protecting our environment. The sportsmen and sportswomen of this state have the right to know that in the years to come, their kids and their grandchildren will be able to enjoy the streams, the lakes, and the forests of the state. They can go out and hunt. They can go out and fish. But they're not going to have that unless we begin to control development, which is destroying the countryside, unless we preserve the family farm, unless we radically change the priorities of this nation so that all people have the right to enjoy life and not just the super rich.
Bernie Sanders, thank you. Peter Diamondstone?
I won't do anything for sports persons. If I go to Congress, my goal is to do things for everyone. I have an agricultural policy, I have a whole group of policies in mind, but they have to work for everyone, right? So my answer to that question is, you know, I'm concerned about the bread that everybody eats that ends up as bromated flour that ends up polluting our planet. I'm concerned about chlorine that goes into our water that affects both the fish and the wildlife. I'm concerned about, and you take agricultural policy, I'm concerned about the fertilizers, the chemical fertilizers and the chemical pesticides that are used that end up affecting and offending the lakes and the rivers that sports persons use. But that's for all of us. Nobody talked about the two issues when they talk about gun control, and you got to talk about the flag burning and the right to keep and bear arms together. You cannot separate those two. And what's happening is that we are being divided, and we're going to lose both of them.
Thank you. All right, Dolores.
Well, coming from Vermont, I'm not only doing something for my constituents in Vermont, but for the nation and the world, in looking at the environmental problems that we're facing as a world community. And my having lived and visited, and it's not just as a tourist, in 17, 18 countries, in different continents, I have had an opportunity to see the impact of different kinds of problems. And I know that we must work together. It's not just corporate greed that brings about the environmental problems, because we can look at Eastern European countries with the burning of soft coal and other kinds of problems that are socialist economies, and they have not done any better. As a matter of fact, perhaps done quite a bit worse. So we have to all work together, and we don't need to rediscover the wheel. We know what the possibilities are, and we have to put our attention to it. And being involved with the international organizations like the United Nations will help us to do that. What has occurred under the Republican administration is the backing away from participation in this kind of an international organization where all peoples, all levels can come together. So it's not just the air and the water in certain areas of the world, but the people who inhabit those areas also. So human rights is a part of that environmental picture that I would speak to.
Thank you, Dolores. Congressman Smith, Peter Smith.
I think, and to anyone who says or asks the question, is the Congress working as well as it ought to? The answer is no. There's work to be done. We've got problems, and we're frankly trying to solve them, whether you look at environmental issues or fish and wildlife issues or the S&L crisis that I've been working on so hard for the last month. The fact is there is work to be done, and I would say to Vermont sportsmen and women and to Vermonters in general, I think I've proven that I can work with people. I think when we look at what it took to get the Lake Champlain oil amendment, the lamprey sighting issue resolved, and I helped resolve those two things, it's because I could go to people of both parties and make the system work for Vermont. In terms of the question of guns, I just have to tell you that what my two opponents are saying, I think, is ridiculous. Vermont's values are, this isn't these 9, 10, 11 guns. It's not gun control. It's common sense. The NRA strategy from the beginning. First, they talked about guns. That didn't work, so they attacked my family. That didn't work, so they put up posters with me and Adolf Hitler. That didn't work, so they decided to go after the issue of credibility. Why? Because the last thing they want to talk about is whether or not those 11 guns, which most Vermont hunters do not either own or want to use, and many of them, I would say a majority, think could reasonably be restricted, because they know they're going to lose that argument. And in closing, I'll say, Bernie, in the Free Press in 1988, you said gun control was a local issue. This is a federal issue. I'm delighted to see that you've come along and you think that we need the Dickens-Cheney bill.
please.
You know what I said. You were the one with the NRA endorsement, and I find it interesting.
Thank you, Bernie. Thank you, Peter.